Hello and welcome to Homegrown KC, a podcast dedicated to exploring Kansas City's fascinating history and sharing stories from its rich past. I'm your host, Laura. With me today is Kristie Wolferman. Hi, Kristie.
Hi, how are you, Laura?
Doing good. Glad
Good.
to have you on the show. So, can you tell us about your background, your education, career path?
Okay. I have a history degree from Middlebury College and a master's in history from University of Missouri, Kansas City. I spent 20 years as a docent at the Nelson Atkins Museum, and I've taught school for 34 years. So I've always been interested in the history of the Nelson Atkins.
What school do you teach at? Do you
I taught
currently
at Pembroke
teach?
Hill for 20 years, and then I taught at a school in North Carolina, an independent school.
Okay. So, are you currently teaching or are you retired?
I'm retired.
Congratulations. Are you enjoying retirement?
Yes, it seems to be busier than working because you don't have a set number of hours you have to be someplace. You don't have an excuse to not do things.
So, what did you, let me rephrase that. What was your focus during your history degrees?
American history. And I wrote my master's thesis on the history of the Nelson Atkins Museum because I was a docent there and nothing had been written about the Nelson Atkins. But it was kind of a struggle to write it because there were no archives at the museum at the time. And so I went to talk to the then director of the museum, Mark Wilson, and I told him what I wanted to do. And he said, well, fine, but I don't know where to tell you to look for information. So he gave me carte blanche to look around the museum. And I looked in all the typical places, the library, curators' offices, etc. And amazingly enough, in the boiler room, with this boiler that had been put in when the museum opened in 1933, I found boxes of letters from the first curator of Asian art, written from China back to the museum trustees. I found trustees' minutes. It was just a wealth of information, which is really fun. So I was able to set up a table in the boiler room and work down there for a couple of months. And then I found other information, talking to trustees, visiting libraries, etc.
Wow, I have so many reactions to that. First, ouch. I'm sure those documents were not in the best of condition. But
Amazing.
also, so cool that you found it hidden away, which I've talked about happens on the show. I've talked about on the show all the time, happens all the time.
Yeah.
So, what was the thesis of your master's then?
Well, the thesis was basically about the early history of the museum, about the founders and about the serendipity that happened just from various trustees of several different estates coming together and pooling their funds in order to build the Nelson Atkins Museum. So then the University of Missouri Press asked me to expand my thesis to be published as a book, which I did, and that was published in 1993. And just 3 years ago, I think it's been now, I was approached by the University of Missouri Press. Actually, I think I called them first because I was surprised that there weren't any books for sale, my books for sale in the Nelson Atkins Museum bookstore. And I found out that they were out of print. And so the University of Missouri Press asked me if I would like to update the book because they didn't want to reissue it in the 1993 version. The 1993 version only went up to World War II. So I thought, this is going to be easy. There are now archives in the museum. This is going to be just updating it from then till now. But it wasn't easy because so much more information had been found. So it was a challenge, but a very fun challenge.
That's so cool. You anticipated a couple of questions I was going to ask about how the book came to be. So, what is the most surprising thing you found in your research then?
I guess just that that everything seems so simple then about coordinating these various art interests into one museum, and the construction of the museum itself. There was a one-page contract written with John Coleman Long, who was hired as the contractor, and all it said was that he would build the museum for about $2.5 million, and with all the excellence he could. And I mean, it was just such a simple contract, and he did it, and he was very proud of the fact afterwards that almost all the people who were hired were Kansas Cityans, and almost all the materials came from Kansas City, which was a great
very cool
to the city, because it was 1933 when the museum was open. So many people were put to work during the Depression who would not have had jobs.
Yeah, that's excellent. I know that the city actually had a lot of similar projects that helped employ its citizens.
Yeah.
So we have Mary Atkins and William Rockwell Nelson, who are both like, when I'm gone, you have to build this museum. Why do you think it was important for Kansas Cityans at that time, and especially these two that we have in our museum?
Well, I think Kansas Cityans had wanted an art museum for a long time, because I think they felt like other cities had them and we wanted to keep up. But Mary Atkins was very, very close with her money, and no one really realized that she had $1 million estate when she died in 1911, and that she was even that interested in art museums, because she was a rather reclusive person. But she'd gone to Europe 6 times and gone around the world once, and she'd seen how important culture is and how important art is. And she wanted her adopted city of Kansas City to have an art museum. William Rockwell Nelson, on the other hand, was a very public figure who was the editor-in-chief and owner of the Kansas City Star newspaper. And he made his point very clear in the newspaper that Kansas City needed a lot of things in order to be a cultivated city. From the time he started the paper in 1888, he preached about we needed good streets, we needed parks, we needed a good sewage system and waterworks, and we needed art museums, we needed culture. And he gave a collection of old masters reproductions to the Kansas City Library for all people to be able to go in and look at and appreciate. And then when he died, his will specified that his papers should be sold after the death of his wife and daughter, and the proceeds should be used to buy art for the delectation and enjoyment of the public.
Oh, I hadn't realized that he sold the newspaper. Do you know who he sold it to? I mean, after his estate?
Yes. The paper was sold to his son-in-law, Irwin Kirkwood, and his associates. It was a group of people who worked at the Star who bought the paper.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, a couple more questions about the museum. I've heard it said, and I've seen in my research, that the Nelson has the largest collection of Asian art outside of Asia. So there's 2 questions I have here. Do you know if that's true or not? And, I guess there's 3 actually. Do you know if by Asia they mean just China or all of Asia? And then finally, how did we get so many of these pieces?
Okay, maybe it's easiest to start with the last question first, because Lawrence Sickman was a student in China during the time that our trustees started collecting art. And because the 3 trustees didn't really know anything about art, they had to hire advisors. And one of the advisors they hired was a man named Langdon Warner, and he was their Asian art advisor. He was a Harvard scholar, and his student, Lawrence Sickman, was in China. Well, it turns out that Lawrence Sickman had a real eye for Chinese art, and he was able to really over time send back some fabulous pieces for the museum. So that started our Chinese collection. And
Okay.
it continued to grow because after Sickman was a student in China, he came back to be curator of Asian art, and then, which was called Oriental art at the time, and then assistant director, and then director of the museum. And so I think that probably we have the largest collection and the finest collection of Chinese art outside of China. We also have a lot of fabulous Asian art besides Chinese art. I don't know whether it ranks up there with every other museum in the country.
Right. Sorry, Sickman's teacher, what was his name?
Langdon Warner.
Warner. How did they end up choosing him to be the director and advisor?
Well, he was an advisor, not a director. Well, the main model for the Nelson Atkins at the time was the Cleveland Museum of Art. And Cleveland, I mean, not only did we model the neoclassical building after the Cleveland Museum, but we also used their advisors. Langdon Warner worked for Cleveland, as did Harold Woodbury Parsons, who was our European advisor. So those two people we used in conjunction with the Cleveland Museum of Art.
Okay.
Yeah.
Having worked there for so long, do you have a favorite piece of art or a period?
No, I don't, because there's just so many things to see. I think there's some remarkable collections. I love Impressionism, so I love going through the block collection and seeing all the way that it's been hung in juxtaposition with the pieces that the museum already had in its possession, including some pieces that dated back to William Raquel Nelson's daughter, Laura Nelson. She had two pieces of Impressionist art that are in the collection. So I love that. I love the Egyptian collection. And I think that the American Indian collection is outstanding. And especially the fact that it's right there next to the American art section, making it seem like our museum is one of the few museums in the world that puts American art and American Indian art or Native American art together, because it's showing our whole heritage. So I think that's wonderful too.
Yeah, they really do have a fabulous collection across all different times and geographical locations. So let's swing back around to the second edition of the book. So this includes history of the museum from World War II forward, you said.
Right.
So what kind of history, what kind of stuff happened?
Well, a lot of it is social history, the people involved, and the kinds of collections that we were making. But also some things have been updated. For instance, I'd never heard of Monuments Men when I wrote the first book. I'm not sure that the name really was in the common lexicon, but we had 3 different people in our museum who were monuments men. So that was really interesting. And I really think I realized even more so writing the second part of the book, how much serendipity was involved in getting this museum together. I mean, it just happened that people were able to get along and pool their resources in order to create something that was for the good of the city. So that really impressed me. The second edition is really different because it has a lot of photographs in it, a lot of pictures, and a lot of colored photographs. The first book, when it came out, it was really prohibitive to put in colored works. And actually, when we were talking about this new edition, my editors at the University of Missouri talked about just putting in like 12 pages of colored photographs in the middle of the book, but then decided to make all the pages color sensitive. So the photographs and the illustrations are scattered throughout.
Okay, quick question. Why was it prohibited to include the color photos?
No, it was prohibited. It was too expensive. Prohibited, not prohibited. Sorry, maybe I misspoke. It was just way too expensive at the time for
Yeah.
publication. Yeah.
Now the Monuments Men are really cool. I don't know a ton of that history, but I know a little bit. For those who don't know anything, can you elaborate on what the Monuments Men are and how they worked with the museum?
Yeah, they didn't work with our museum specifically. They were hired by a group, international group of men and women who knew about art and about culture, and they worked through the armed services. I'm trying to remember exactly how many. I think like 300 in the internationally, and the fact that we had 3 in our museum was really amazing. So they were in charge of trying to secure treasures that had been taken away by the Nazis, or restore things to their rightful ownership, and discover where these things had been taken, and basically restore the cultural integrity of the countries who had or the people who'd had things taken from them.
So, if the Nazis never took anything from America, then how does that play in?
Well, yes, we didn't have anyone, but these people, I mean, all these people were serving in Europe. Lawrence Sigmund was in Europe, and then in Asia, and Paul Gardner, who was the director of the museum at the time, was in Europe. And then we also had another person who was in Europe. So they were restoring things to their rightful owners and European owners. And there were some things that were secured, like a crown, the Hungarian crown for the emperor that was very pricey, was rescued, and it was sent to Fort Knox for the duration of the war in order to preserve it. So there were things that were brought to the United States in order to keep them safe, but otherwise they were returned to their owners. And they were working after the war. I mean, they didn't even start until 1944, 45, and they didn't come home until 46 or 47.
See, I didn't think they'd been there since the beginning, but I didn't realize that they basically didn't start till the end of the war.
Right. So these people that were with us who've been sent into service, they were doing other things before they became Monuments Men.
Mm-hmm. Well, I didn't have any other questions prepared. Is there anything else you'd like to tell us about the museum or about your work?
Well, I think that it's important to realize that the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art was very forward-thinking in so many ways. When it was created, there was no other museum in the country that had a Native American collection, because Native American art was relegated in other cities in the country to natural history museums. So it was very forward-thinking of our trustees to put American Indian art in the museum. The other thing is, there were no other museums that had photography. And we started having photograph shows from the very beginning of the museum. And then in the 1940s, began acquiring a photographic collection, and now have an extremely fine collection of photographs in the museum. So there are just some things about the museum that were very innovative and at the time, and still are considered innovative.
That's awesome. Yeah, I know that we do have an awesome photograph collection.
Uh-huh.
And I've noticed that a lot of museums, for example, we have the ancient Egyptian art section. But I've noticed a lot of museums, just like with the Native American, they put it in natural history. So it's almost like saying, this is an art. You're not human. This isn't a product of human endeavors.
Right. It was considered ethnic art, whereas our museum has never considered African art or Egyptian art or Native American art as ethnic art. It's all art, because our museum set out to be an art museum, an historical art museum that represented all peoples.
Mm-hmm. Anything else?
Gosh, I don't think so.
Sorry, I feel like I should have prepared more questions, but I was like, oh, this will cover it. We're good.
I think also in this day and age when we keep trying to change history and rewrite history and take away names from things that were named. I think it's important that we realize who these people are, and even if they had certain foibles, that they did a lot of really good things. And I know J.C. Nichols, who was one of the first trustees of the museum, did an amazing number of good things for the city. William Raquel Nelson, also, who's been accused of being someone who had covenants on the real estate he sold. I mean, yes, that was wrong. We're judging him from our perspective today, but he did so many amazing things for our city. So I just think that we need to preserve what we can about our history, and thank these people for doing what they did.
Yeah, it can be difficult to balance, our cultural mores versus theirs, but yeah, both of those men that you named did do wonderful things for the city.
Mm-hmm. And Mary Atkins, we need to credit her too. In fact, I've said in the past that Mary Atkins, if the museum were being named today, she might have her name first, because she left more money to build a museum than any of the other people involved in the museum. I mean, Nelson only left money to buy art, not only because it was $11 million, but so I think today, in today's culture, we'd probably call it the Mary Atkins Nelson Museum or something like that.
It's funny. I was actually thinking about that this morning. Because it's Nelson Atkins, I know that a lot of the time I and my friends are like, yeah, we're going to go to the Nelson. And it's kind of cutting her out, which really sucks.
Yeah. Well, for years, the official name was the William Raquel Nelson Gallery of Art and Mary Atkins Museum of Fine Arts. Well, that was just too much to say. So I grew up here with everyone calling the museum the Nelson or the gallery, rather than putting her name in it. But when you walk into the museum and you walk into Kirkwood Hall, on one side is the Atkins Museum, on the other side is the Nelson Museum. And Mary Atkins funds were originally going to be used to build a museum down by where the Liberty Memorial is now. But when William Raquel Nelson's funds were made available, the trustees were able to see that they needed to put those art interests together. But they've still been kept separate. There are still trustees for the Atkins Museum and for the Nelson Museum.
Oh, really? Okay.
Uh-huh.
When they pulled their funds, I just kind of assumed that they had become one foundation or trustees.
Well, they are basically, but there are still trustees for the Atkins Museum.
Do you know, because there was a big gap between both of their deaths and the actual creation of the museum, do you know how close that they came to building the location down at Liberty Memorial?
Pretty close. I mean, within months, they had it all specced out. And then Laura Nelson Kirkwood, William Raquel Nelson's daughter, died. And with her death meant that the newspapers had to be sold and the money used to invest in works of art. And so according to Laura Nelson Kirkwood's will, Oak Hall, which is where her family lived, this big English Tudor house on top of the hill where the Nelson Atkins Museum is now, was given to her husband. But if he wanted to sell it, he would have to have the house raised. And so he decided to give the property to the city in order to build the Nelson Gallery of Art there. And so at that point, there happened to be one common trustee between the Atkins and the Nelson trustees, and that was Herbert B. Jones. He was a trustee for both estates, and he's the one who really said, let's put these interests together, and we will kind of scrap our plans. We'll scrap our plans at Penn Valley, but in fact, when they built the museum, the Atkins side of the museum was totally finished because it had already been sketched out by White and White, the architects. The Nelson side was left unfinished until future need dictated that it needed to be completed. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of, it was serendipity.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I love the location that it's currently at, and it is such a beautiful building. But I'm also really sad that we lost the house.
I know. And, the house next door across the street was where Laura Nelson Kirkwood and her husband lived, the one that was the Rock Hill Tennis Club, and now is, I think, been sold privately. But it's
I think
also a
so.
beautiful stone house, just not as gracious as O'Call was.
And so I listened to an interview that you gave a few weeks ago with the University of Missouri, and you said that all of the items in the house were sold off, right? And like we don't have any of them. We don't know where they are. Is that right?
Everything was sold, including, everything was carted off from the place. We do have the two Impressionist paintings that were in Laura Nelson's collection. And interestingly enough, they went through the house. The trustees went through the house, Laura Nelson Kirkwood's trustees, and they put aside everything they thought the museum might want to have someday. And they put it in storage. And it wasn't until 1944, while all these men are serving in World War II, and we had an acting director of the museum named Ethelene Jackson, and she's like, what are we doing with all this stuff still in storage? So they pulled it out. She identified some things that we definitely wanted to keep. Then everything else was sold. But it could only be sold. Well, what her will said was it's any of her personal effects had to be sold at least 250 miles away from Kansas City. They were really
oddly specific.
Yeah. But I think what ended up happening actually is that they had the sale here, but people had to come in and sign a document saying they lived 250 miles away. Yeah. I know that because my mother-in-law bought some things, and she at the time was in Tulsa, Oklahoma, because her husband was away at war, and she came back to visit her family and bought some things from Laura Nelson Kirkwood's estate.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Small world. Well, if you don't have anything else you want to grace us with, just all the knowledge in your brain, I think we can call that a day.
Okay. I'm sure there's a lot more up there, but I don't know what would be of great interest. I have to say that I found doing this research absolutely fascinating, mainly because of the stories that people told. And so many people have memories of going to the museum as children, taking classes there. And I guess that's another really important part of the museum, the education part, because not all art museums were built to be educational facilities from the very beginning. And yet ours was. We had classrooms, and we had a library, and we had an auditorium. And children's classes were started right away, even though they didn't have really the personnel to be able to handle them. They had the switchboard operator teach marionette building, but they wanted to start a docent program right away to guide children through the museum, and they didn't have the personnel to do it. So it turned out that Paul Gardner, who was sitting next to Jane Hemingway Gordon, who was the chairman of the Arts Committee of the Junior League of Kansas City, Missouri, suggested to him that the Junior League could be trained to give tours of the museum. And so they did that, and it set a precedent for other museums. The Metropolitan followed it, and we started a docent program like no other museum in the country. So I think that's pretty neat too.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, thank you for joining us today, Kristie. I really appreciate it.
You're certainly welcome. And hopefully we all can go back into the museum without having to buy a ticket, not having to buy, but just get a ticket. Hopefully we'll be able to go at free will from very soon now.
Yeah, I think we will. Yeah. I see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, me too. Okay. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Listeners, I have been holding on to this recording for so long. I am so glad I can finally release it out into the world. Kristie was wonderful to speak with. Her book is just filled with information. It's an amazing read and very easy to read. Excellent photos as well. So, some announcements before we sign off. I have a merchandise store. I hope you all visit that. It's Zazzle, ZAZZLE.com/store/homegrown_KC_store. Got some new items out, some t-shirts and some hats, and then of course we have coffee mugs, a beer mug, some buttons and pins. Make sure you follow the show on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, and Twitter. Homegrown KC on all of those. I'll have announcements and photographs. You can also visit the website for more information on each individual topic. That's homegrownkc.wordpress.com. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or episode suggestions, please email me at homegrownkcpodcast@gmail.com. You can access my email through the website as well, or you can message me on Facebook or the thing with the photographs. You can message me on Instagram. There we go. I'm also now available on a new audio-based platform called Audia. And if you use the code 0, capital E, capital F, capital Y, 1, capital A, you can create a free profile and then follow me on the show. Follow my show on Audia. Audia is also now an app. There is an app available. Thank you for supporting the show. I appreciate all of you. Thanks goes out to my sister-in-law, Sarah McCombs, for the creation of my logo, to the Dear Uses for the use of their song Kansas City as the intro and outro music of the show, to local libraries, which enabled me to gather all my research, and a special thank you to Kristie. Bye-bye.
Seem to shake this feeling, and I can't seem to get you off my mind. Thought love